"Do not wipe that off," Naomi Carter said as cold coffee ran from her shoulder onto the federal training files. "It is evidence now." The laughter in the break room stopped for half a second, then Officer Tyler Briggs laughed even harder. Officer Blake Harlan remained beside the table, holding the empty paper cup with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed everyone around him understood the joke. Brown liquid spread across Naomi's pale blouse and soaked into the folder beneath her hand, bending the corners of pages stamped with a seal Blake had not bothered to read. He looked at the temporary visitor badge clipped near her collar and smiled. "Evidence of what? Bad luck on your first day?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She looked at the clock above the vending machines. 11 minutes remained before the mandatory training session began. Then she took out her phone, photographed the ruined documents, the empty cup, and the identification numbers on Blake's and Tyler's uniforms. Blake's smile faded. "You taking pictures of us?" "I document conduct before I evaluate it," Naomi replied. Tyler leaned against the counter. "Evaluate it? Lady, you are the new support hire. Start by learning who matters in this building." Naomi felt the coffee cooling against her skin, carrying the bitter smell of burned beans and artificial creamer. No one reached for the incident log mounted beside the door. A civilian employee picked up a roll of paper towels, but Naomi raised one hand. "Leave it exactly as it is." Blake stepped closer, not threatening, only offended that she had refused to play the role he had assigned her. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Naomi met his eyes. "The person evaluating you in 11 minutes. 2 hours earlier, she had arrived at the Metro Public Safety Training Center in a rented sedan, without an escort or official vehicle. A software failure had delayed her permanent identification badge, so the receptionist issued a temporary pass marked visitor and pointed her toward the service elevator. Naomi carried a locked equipment case in one hand and pushed a cart of training materials with the other. 3 employees passed without offering help. One asked whether she was delivering office supplies. Naomi simply said, "Training materials," and continued down the fluorescent hallway. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when they believed status was absent. That morning, the building had revealed plenty. Blake and Tyler were already in the break room complaining about the federal course scheduled for 9 o'clock. Blake called outside instructors, conference room experts, who had never faced real pressure. Tyler agreed, saying the class would probably be another lecture about feelings. When Naomi entered and began organizing folders, Blake pointed toward the coffee machine. "Fresh pot is empty," he said. "Make yourself useful." Naomi looked at the training schedule taped beside the refrigerator. His name appeared near the top. "I am preparing for the course." Tyler smirked. "Then prepare some coffee." Naomi returned to the documents. Blake poured the last cup for himself and watched her ignore him. The room became quieter, not because anyone objected, but because several people were waiting to see what he would do. Lieutenant Susan Keller appeared in the doorway just as Blake tipped the cup over Naomi's files. She saw the coffee strike the folder. She saw Tyler laugh. She saw Naomi standing perfectly still. Keller's expression tightened, but instead of opening an incident report, she said, "Blake, that is enough." Then she looked at Naomi. "He jokes with everyone. It is better not to make this bigger than it is." Naomi turned the camera of her phone toward the stained folder, then toward Keller. "Is that your official assessment?" Keller did not answer. From the corridor outside came the distant sound of 40 chairs shifting across a training room floor. Naomi checked the clock again. 9 minutes remained. She lifted the soaked files, picked up the locked equipment case, and walked past all 3 officers without another word. Behind her, Blake called, "Someone should tell the real instructor her assistant is having a rough morning." Naomi kept walking. At the end of the hallway, she stopped outside the largest classroom in the building, entered a security code "No support employee." Should have known, and opened the door. Inside, local officers, federal agents, and unit supervisors were already waiting. Naomi crossed to the front, placed the coffee-stained folder on the lectern, and watched Blake enter through the rear doors with the smile still on his face. He had 8 minutes left before he understood that the lesson had already begun. Blake took a seat near the center aisle, still wearing the easy grin of someone expecting the real instructor to arrive at any moment. Tyler dropped into the chair beside him and leaned close enough to whisper, but the room had grown too quiet for secrecy. Naomi stood behind the lectern with the stained folder resting beneath one hand. Coffee had darkened the edge of her blouse and left a damp line along her sleeve, yet she made no attempt to hide it. 40 officers, agents, and supervisors watched her connect the locked equipment case to the projection system. The screen remained black. Lieutenant Keller entered last and stopped near the rear wall when she saw Naomi at the front. Her face changed, but she said nothing. Blake raised one hand without waiting to be acknowledged. "Are you setting up for the instructor?" A few people glanced toward him. Naomi looked at the clock. 7 minutes remained. "Please take out a sheet of paper," she said. Blake leaned back. "I asked a question. And I gave an instruction." Her tone was calm, neither loud nor defensive. That seemed to irritate him more than anger would have. Tyler laughed under his breath. "You cannot order officers around because you found the projector switch." Naomi opened the stained folder and removed 40 blank observation forms. She passed the first stack to a federal agent seated near the aisle. "Write down everything you observed in the building during the last 10 minutes, she said. "Do not interpret motive. Record actions, words, timing, and who was present." The agent began distributing the pages without hesitation. Blake looked toward the rear door, expecting someone to interrupt. No one did. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked. Naomi placed a small digital recorder beside the folder. "A baseline." Keller stepped forward. "A mess. Carter, perhaps we should speak privately before this continues." Naomi looked at her. "Was the break room private?" Keller stopped. The room felt smaller. Chairs shifted. Pens touched paper. Blake's smile disappeared completely. Naomi walked around the lectern and stood beneath the blank screen. "Most professional failures do not begin with missing information," she said. "They begin when people decide what information deserves attention." She pointed toward the observation forms. "Some of you saw a visitor carrying secured training equipment. Some saw an employee moving supplies. Some saw a black woman who could be instructed without introduction. What did you do with that first impression?" Blake folded his arms. "This is ridiculous. You are turning a joke into a lecture." Naomi looked at the coffee stain on her sleeve. "Then describe the joke." Tyler stared at the paper in front of him. Blake gave a short laugh, but no one joined him. "I spilled coffee." "Accidentally?" Naomi asked. He hesitated. "It was not serious." "That was not my question." Keller looked toward the federal agents seated along the left side of the room. Several had stopped writing and were watching Blake. He shifted in his chair. She ignored a simple request. Naomi nodded once. "A request to prepare coffee for you." She was standing beside the machine. "So were you." The answer came softly, but it crossed the room without effort. Tyler looked down. Naomi returned to the lectern and opened the equipment case. Inside were encrypted drives, federal course materials, and a red access badge turned face down. She did not reveal it. Not yet. Instead, she activated the screen. A live feed from the hallway security system appeared, showing the break room door, the clock, and the officers entering and leaving. The video had no sound. "Watch only behavior," Naomi said. On the screen, she entered carrying the locked case and a cart of folders. Blake pointed toward the coffee machine. Tyler smiled. Naomi returned to her work. Keller appeared in the doorway. Then Blake lifted the cup and tipped it over the documents. Without audio, the action looked smaller than cruelty and larger than a mistake. It looked deliberate. The room watched Keller remain still. Naomi paused the image at the exact moment coffee struck the federal seal. "Write what you see," she said. Pens began moving again. Blake stared at his own frozen hand on the screen. "You planned this," he said. Naomi met his eyes. "I planned a training session. You supplied the first case study." The clock reached 9 o'clock. The side door opened, and Director Evelyn Ross entered with Agent Marcus Hill and 6 members of a federal crisis response unit. Marcus saw Naomi at the lectern, then noticed the stain across her blouse. His expression sharpened. He turned toward the class and stood at attention. "Good morning, Dr. Carter," he said. Every pen in the room stopped. Marcus Hill's greeting changed the temperature of the room. Blake's shoulders stiffened. Tyler stopped smiling. Director Evelyn Ross walked to the front with the measured confidence of someone who did not need to announce authority before it was felt. Naomi turned the red access badge inside the equipment case and clipped it beside the temporary visitor pass. The federal seal caught the projection light. Beneath her name was the title Blake had never imagined: Lead Instructor, Interagency Crisis Response and Behavioral Assessment. Marcus faced the class. "Dr. Carter designed the de-escalation framework used by my unit, the Regional Hostage Negotiation Team, and 3 federal field offices. Every agent standing behind me completed her certification." Blake looked from Marcus to Naomi, then toward Keller as though waiting for her to explain how the woman from the break room had become the most qualified person in the building. Keller had no explanation. She had seen the coffee spill. She had heard Naomi identify herself as an evaluator. She had chosen convenience over curiosity. Evelyn placed a sealed folder on the lectern. "This course is not a routine seminar," she said. "The Department of Justice approved Metro Public Safety as a candidate for the new Regional Crisis Response Partnership. Dr. Carter is conducting the final organizational assessment." A murmur moved through the room. Participation in the partnership would bring federal resources, advanced training, and access to specialized response teams. Blake had spent months arguing that his unit deserved a place in it. Now the woman he had dismissed would help determine whether the department was ready. Naomi did not look pleased by his discomfort. She turned back to the frozen security image. "The evaluation measures more than tactical knowledge," she said. "It measures how people make decisions when status is unclear, when assumptions arrive before facts, and when group loyalty pressures someone to ignore misconduct." She advanced the video. The image showed Tyler laughing. Another frame showed Keller watching from the doorway. A third showed 2 civilian employees looking away. Naomi stopped the recording. "This was not a planned scenario," she said. "That makes it more useful." Blake stood. "I already said it was a joke." Evelyn looked at him. "Sit down, Officer Harlan." He remained standing for one breath too long, then lowered himself into the chair. Naomi lifted the stained federal folder. The pages inside were warped, but the ink remained readable. "This contained today's assessment materials," she said. "The damage can be replaced. The decision behind it is harder to repair." Blake's face reddened. "You are making assumptions about my motives." Naomi nodded. "That is possible. Which is why I documented the conduct, preserved the recording, and asked for an independent review before reaching a conclusion." She let the contrast remain without explaining it. Marcus distributed a second form to the class. At the top were 3 questions: what did you observe? What did you assume? What action did you take? Tyler read them and shifted in his seat. Keller stood near the wall, her arms no longer folded. Naomi addressed the room. "Bias is not proven by one uncomfortable feeling. It becomes visible through patterns: who receives patience, who receives suspicion, whose explanation is accepted, and whose refusal is treated as disrespect." She looked toward Blake. "When you believed I was support staff, you expected service without introduction. When I declined, you treated that boundary as a challenge. When Lieutenant Keller..." "So what happened?" She minimized it to preserve harmony. Keller's voice was quiet. "That is true." Blake turned toward her. "Susan. Do not ask me to protect you from the record," Keller said. The words surprised everyone, including herself. Naomi watched the room absorb the first real break in its old loyalty. Evelyn opened the sealed folder. "Effective immediately, the department's eligibility assessment is paused. An outside team will review this incident and prior complaints involving workplace conduct, discrimination, and supervisory response." Tyler looked toward Blake. Blake stared at the stained documents. "So 1 cup of coffee could cost the entire department a federal partnership?" Naomi's expression remained steady. "No. 1 cup of coffee revealed what the partnership was designed to measure. Marcus moved to the side of the lectern, leaving Naomi alone at the center. The question is not whether your department can pass a class, she said. The question is whether it can face evidence without punishing the person who brings it. Then she turned off the security footage. The screen went black, reflecting 40 faces back at themselves. For the first time that morning, no one looked at Naomi as the person who needed to prove she belonged. The training session did not resume. Evelyn Ross asked everyone to remain seated while the outside review team secured the room, copied the observation forms, and preserved the hallway footage. Naomi stood beside the lectern with coffee drying against her sleeve, watching officers who had entered expecting a lecture now confront the possibility that their ordinary behavior had become evidence. Blake kept his eyes on the dark projection screen. Tyler stared at the blank form in front of him. Keller moved away from the wall and took a seat in the first row, no longer separated from the people whose conduct would be examined. Before anyone leaves, Evelyn said, each person will submit a factual account. No group discussions. No shared language. Write what you personally saw, heard, and did. Pens began moving. Naomi opened a fresh folder from her equipment case and placed the damaged one inside a clear evidence sleeve. The brown stain had spread across the federal seal and blurred part of the course title, but the time and date remained visible. Blake raised his head. You are treating this like a criminal case. Naomi looked at him. I am treating it like a professional conduct review. There is a difference. Then respect the process designed to determine that difference. He leaned back, frustration tightening his face. You came here looking for a problem. Naomi remained still. I came here carrying training materials. You decided what I was before asking my name. Tyler shifted beside him. We did not know who you were. Naomi turned toward him. That is the point. The room went quiet again. Marcus collected the first completed statements and placed them in a sealed envelope. One civilian employee wrote that she had seen Blake point toward the coffee machine as soon as Naomi entered. Another admitted she had considered offering help but stopped because no one else moved. A young officer described Keller's expression after the spill and wrote that he expected her to intervene. She had not. Keller read her own form twice before signing it. I told myself I was preventing conflict, she said quietly. What I actually prevented was accountability. Blake looked toward her. You have supervised me for 8 years. And I have excused too much for almost as long. Her admission did not sound brave. It sounded expensive. Evelyn asked Blake to surrender his access card for the remainder of the review. He placed it on the table but held his hand over it for several seconds. Am I suspended? You are removed from the federal assessment pending investigation, Evelyn said. Your department will determine your duty status. Blake finally released the card. Tyler was also removed from the course, while Keller remained only as a subject of the supervisory review. Naomi did not request harsher punishment. She did not smile when the cards were collected. The purpose was not to reverse humiliation. It was to stop authority from hiding behind familiarity. When the room emptied, Marcus approached the lectern. You could have identified yourself immediately, he said. Naomi looked at the temporary visitor badge still clipped beside her federal credentials. Then they would have respected the title instead of the person. She nodded. Through the glass wall, Blake stood alone in the hallway while Captain William Mercer from Internal Affairs reviewed the first statements. His posture no longer carried the casual certainty from the break room. Tyler tried to speak to him, but the captain separated them before they could compare accounts. Keller waited on a bench with her hands folded. Naomi watched them for a moment, then turned back to the stained folder. Does this happen often? Marcus asked. Not always with coffee, she said. Usually with interruptions, assumptions, missing invitations, or jokes everyone is expected to survive quietly. Evelyn returned carrying a preliminary complaint summary. There are 4 earlier reports involving Officer Harlan, she said. 2 from civilian staff, 1 from a probationary officer, and 1 from a community liaison. All were resolved informally by Lieutenant Keller. Keller heard the words from the hallway and closed her eyes. Blake turned toward the conference room, but the glass reflected his own face back at him. Naomi opened the summary. The descriptions were different, but the pattern was familiar: public embarrassment, dismissive humor, and complaints reduced to personality conflicts. She placed the report beside the coffee-stained folder. The morning had begun with 1 cup. By noon, it had uncovered years of silence. By early afternoon, the 4 earlier complaints had been transferred to the outside review team. Naomi sat in a small conference room with Evelyn, Marcus, and Captain William Mercer while the stained folder rested inside its clear evidence sleeve at the center of the table. The room smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and the industrial cleaner used throughout the training center. On the wall, a digital clock advanced without sound. Each complaint carried different names, different dates, and the same pattern. A civilian records clerk had been mocked for asking Blake to follow a secure document procedure. A probationary officer had been embarrassed during roll call after questioning an inaccurate report. A community liaison had been told she was too sensitive when Blake imitated her accent in front of colleagues. The 4th complaint came from a maintenance supervisor who said Blake regularly treated black employees as though they were invisible until he needed something from them. None of the reports had resulted in formal discipline. Each had been labeled a misunderstanding, a personality conflict, or informal workplace humor. Keller had signed every closure. Captain Mercer removed his glasses and placed them beside the files. This should have reached Internal Affairs months ago. Evelyn looked through the glass wall toward the hallway where Keller remained seated. It reached a supervisor who believed protecting the unit meant containing the complaint. Naomi opened the report from the probationary officer. The young man had written one sentence twice: "I stopped speaking because every correction became proof that I did not belong." Naomi read it slowly. "That is what informal resolution can cost," she said. "The conduct survives, and the person who reported it learns silence." Marcus looked toward Blake, who was now being interviewed in a separate office. "He still believes this is about one bad joke." "Then the review must show him the pattern without exaggerating it," Naomi replied. "If we turn him into a monster, he can dismiss everything as punishment. He needs to see the ordinary decisions that made the pattern possible." Captain Mercer nodded. "What do you recommend?" Naomi closed the complaint file. "Independent findings first. Corrective action second. No promises of reinstatement, no public performance of apology, and no requirement that the people he harmed forgive him." Evelyn studied her. "And if he refuses responsibility?" "Then the department decides whether someone who rejects evidence can continue exercising authority." Across the hall, Keller was called into the interview room. She entered without the confidence she had carried that morning. Captain Mercer asked why she had repeatedly resolved complaints without formal review. Keller looked at the printed reports lined across the table. "Because Blake was productive," she said. "He handled difficult assignments. Other officers trusted him." "Did the complainants trust him?" Keller lowered her eyes. "No, did you believe them?" She hesitated. "I believed something happened. I did not believe it was serious enough to damage his career." The investigator leaned forward. "So you protected his career by asking others to absorb the damage?" Keller's face tightened. For the first time, she had no administrative language left to soften the truth. "Yes," she said. In the next room, Blake reviewed the break room footage with no sound. The investigator paused at the moment he pointed toward the coffee machine. "What did you know about Ms. Carter then?" "Nothing." "What did you assume?" Blake crossed his arms. "That she worked support." "Why?" "She had a visitor badge. She was moving materials. Several white instructors entered with visitor badges that morning." "Did you ask any of them to make coffee?" Blake stared at the frozen image. "No," the investigator advanced the video to the spill. "Was it accidental?" Blake looked down. "No, why did you do it?" His answer took longer. "She ignored me." "Was she required to obey you?" "No," the word left him quietly. The investigator turned on the audio. Tyler's laughter filled the small room. Keller's voice followed, telling Naomi not to make the incident bigger than it was. Blake watched himself smile. Without the comfort of the break room around him, the moment looked different. Smaller than courage. Larger than humor. "I thought she was trying to embarrass me," he said. She had not said your name, the investigator replied. You embarrassed yourself before she evaluated anything. Blake leaned back and closed his eyes. At 4:30, the review team issued preliminary recommendations. Blake would remain off active training assignments pending a full conduct investigation. Tyler would complete a separate review for participation and false minimization in his written account. Keller would be removed from supervisory duties while investigators examined every complaint she had closed informally. The federal partnership assessment would remain paused, but not cancelled. Naomi. Read the recommendations once and signed only the section confirming that her evidence had been accurately recorded. Evelyn asked whether she felt satisfied. Naomi looked through the glass at the empty hallway where the incident had begun. Satisfaction is not the goal. She lifted the evidence sleeve. Coffee had dried into a dark, uneven map across the pages. The goal is that the next person does not need a federal title before someone decides the conduct matters. Outside, evening light settled over the training center. For years, Blake's behavior had survived because each incident was treated as too small to define him. Now the pattern had finally been placed together, and the truth was no longer small. 3 weeks later, Naomi returned to the Metro Public Safety Training Center through the same side entrance she had used on her first morning. Her permanent credentials were waiting at the front desk now, printed correctly, and placed inside a blue protective sleeve. The receptionist stood when Naomi approached and offered to carry her equipment case. Naomi thanked her but kept it in her own hand. She noticed the change, but she did not mistake courtesy for transformation. Real change required more than knowing who deserved respect. It required treating people with dignity before their status was known. The federal partnership assessment had resumed under stricter conditions. An independent compliance observer sat in every session. Complaint procedures were posted beside each break room door. Supervisors could Northwest longer close workplace conduct reports without external review. Keller had not returned to command. She was completing a leadership accountability program while the department examined the cases she had minimized. Tyler remained assigned to administrative duties and had submitted a corrected statement admitting that he laughed because belonging to Blake's circle felt safer than challenging it. Blake had been removed from field training and enrolled in a structured remediation program. None of those actions guaranteed growth. They only created the possibility of it. Naomi entered classroom 3 and found 20 officers seated in a semicircle. Blake sat alone near the far end, wearing a plain training uniform without instructor insignia. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier, not because time had passed, but because certainty no longer protected him. On the table in front of him was a copy of every complaint connected to his conduct. The names had been removed, but the words remained. Dismissed. Interrupted. Mocked. Ignored. Naomi placed the coffee-stained folder on the lectern. The room recognized it immediately. Today is not about proving that Officer Harlan is a bad person, she said. It is about examining what happens when a person believes good intentions make evidence unnecessary. Blake looked at the folder but said nothing. Naomi began with a simulation. A civilian actor entered the room portraying a woman whose son had been detained after a misunderstanding. She spoke quickly, repeated herself, and refused to sit down. Blake's assignment was to establish communication without escalating the tension. He began as he always had. Ma'am, calm down and listen. The actor's voice rose. Blake straightened, ready to repeat the order, then stopped. Naomi watched the pause. It was brief, but deliberate. He lowered his hands. What is your name? He asked. Angela. Angela, tell me what you are afraid will happen next. The room changed. The actor's shoulders loosened. Her words slowed. Blake listened without interrupting. When she finished, he repeated the facts back to her and explained what information he could verify. The scenario ended without anyone raising a voice. Naomi made no comment at first. She allowed the class to write what they had observed. After several minutes, she asked Blake what changed his approach. He looked toward the complaints on the table. I heard urgency and assumed disrespect, he said. Then I remembered that I had done that before. What made you stop? Naomi asked. Blake thought for a moment. I realized I was preparing to control the person before understanding the problem. Several officers lowered their pens. The sentence had no polish, but it carried more weight than an apology written for a file. Naomi moved to the next exercise. This time, Tyler observed, while another officer handled a conflict between two employees. When one participant made a dismissive joke, Tyler hesitated, then spoke. "That is not helpful. Let us return to what happened." His voice shook slightly. No one laughed. At the end of the session, Blake remained seated while the others left. Naomi gathered the observation forms. "I owe you an apology," he said. She did not look up immediately. "You owe several people more than words." "I know." He glanced at the stained folder. "I thought respect was something people earned by proving themselves." Naomi closed the equipment case. "That belief usually protects the person doing the judging." Blake nodded. "I am trying to change it." Naomi lifted the folder and met his eyes. "Then do it when there is no camera, no evaluator, and no federal program watching." Outside the classroom, sunlight stretched across the hallway where employees once looked away. A new incident log hung beside the break room door, untouched and clearly visible. Naomi passed it without stopping. The next test would not belong to her. It would belong to everyone who now knew that silence was also a decision. 2 weeks after the remediation session, the department held its first public listening forum inside the training center auditorium. The room had no raised stage and no reserved seating for rank. Folding chairs formed a wide circle beneath soft overhead lights, placing officers, civilian employees, and community members at the same level. Naomi stood near the back beside Evelyn Ross and Marcus Hill, observing rather than leading. The purpose was not to create a performance of accountability. It was to test whether the department could hear criticism without controlling the terms. Blake entered quietly and took an empty chair near the center. Tyler sat several seats away. Keller arrived last, no longer wearing supervisory insignia, and chose a place beside the civilian records clerk whose complaint she had once closed as a misunderstanding. The clerk did not acknowledge her. No one asked her to. The first speaker was the maintenance supervisor who had written that Blake only noticed black employees when he needed something. He described years of being called by the wrong name, interrupted while explaining safety procedures, and ordered to complete tasks outside his responsibility because officers assumed he would not object. Blake listened with his hands folded. When the supervisor finished, Blake started to speak, then stopped. Naomi noticed the pause. The old Blake would have explained intent. The man in the chair asked, "Would you be willing to tell me which moment stayed with you the longest?" The supervisor studied him. "The moments when everyone else acted like nothing happened." Blake nodded slowly. "I understand." "No," the man replied. "You are beginning to understand." Blake accepted the correction. Next came the former probationary officer, now working for another department. He read the sentence from his original complaint, "I stopped speaking because every correction became proof that I did not belong." Keller lowered her eyes. "I should have protected your right to speak," she said. The young officer looked at her. "You protected the unit from discomfort." "Yes." Keller did not add anything else. The simplicity of the answer made the room quieter than an apology would have. Tyler spoke near the end. He admitted that laughter had become his way of signaling loyalty. "I thought staying close to the strongest personality made me safe," he said. "What I did was make other people less safe." Marcus watched several officers shift in their seats. The words had reached beyond one incident. Naomi remained silent until a community liaison asked why the federal partnership had not been canceled. Evelyn answered, "Because accountability should measure the ability to confront failure, not pretend failure never occurred." She explained that the department would remain under review for 6 months. Federal resources would be conditional. Complaint outcomes would be audited. Supervisory promotions would require independent conduct screening. The partnership could still be denied if the department treated the reforms as temporary. Blake looked toward Naomi. "Does she decide whether we pass?" he asked. Evelyn shook her head. "No single person decides. The record does." The answer mattered. Naomi's title had opened the investigation, but the future could not depend on her personal approval. After the forum, Blake found Naomi in the hallway beside the break room. The new incident log was mounted near the same doorway where Keller had once minimized the coffee spill. "I wanted you to hear what I said," he told her. Naomi looked at him. "Why?" Blake considered the question. "Because part of me still wants credit for changing. That part will make the work harder." He nodded. "I know." Inside the break room, a young black administrative assistant stood beside the coffee machine while two officers entered. One of them started to hand her an empty pot, then paused, filled it himself, and asked whether she needed help carrying a box of files. The moment was small. No one praised it. No camera had been arranged to capture it. Blake watched from the doorway and said nothing. Naomi followed his gaze. "That is where the evaluation really happens," she said. Blake looked at the untouched incident log, then at the ordinary room beyond it. For the first time, he understood that reform would not be proven by one public confession. It would be proven in hundreds of quiet moments when the old behavior was still possible and someone chose differently. For months after the listening forum, the Federal Review team returned for an unannounced assessment. No advance schedule had been shared. No special cleaning crew had prepared the halls. Officers arrived for an ordinary Thursday shift and found Naomi, Evelyn, Marcus, and two independent evaluators waiting near the operations desk. Blake was assigned to a simulated community response exercise with three younger officers. The scenario appeared simple: a black woman stood outside a public library, speaking quickly and refusing to step away from a locked side entrance. A security employee claimed she was causing trouble. Blake approached with the old instinct already forming in his posture. He began to issue a command, then noticed the woman clutching a library identification badge and a ring of keys. He stopped. "What is your name?" he asked. "Monica." "Monica, what is happening here?" She explained that she was the branch manager. The electronic lock had failed, and she was trying to reach an employee trapped inside the records room. The security employee interrupted and insisted she did not look like management. Blake turned toward him. "Her appearance is not evidence. Let her finish." Behind the observation glass, Naomi watched him verify the badge, contact dispatch for building records, and ask Monica what assistance she needed. The problem was resolved in less than 6 minutes. No one was embarrassed. No voice was raised. When the exercise ended, Blake looked toward the glass but could not see whether Naomi was there. That mattered. He had made the better decision without knowing who was watching. Tyler faced a different test in the staff hallway. An administrative employee reported that a senior officer had repeatedly dismissed her instructions about confidential files. Tyler listened, documented the complaint, and contacted the new independent review officer instead of encouraging her to let it go. Keller, still completing her leadership program, observed a supervisor interrupt a civilian trainer 3 times during a briefing. She stepped in calmly and returned the floor to the trainer. None of the moments looked dramatic. Together, they showed whether the department had begun replacing loyalty to comfort with loyalty to conduct. That afternoon, the evaluators met in the same classroom where the coffee-stained folder had first been placed on the lectern. The department had not achieved perfection. 2 complaints had revealed continued resistance among senior staff. Several officers still described the new procedures as excessive. Yet every complaint had been recorded, reviewed, and answered without retaliation. Evelyn opened the final assessment. "The department qualifies for conditional entry into the Regional Crisis Response Partnership," she said. "Oversight will continue for 1 year." Relief moved through the room, but Naomi did not applaud. Conditional approval was not redemption. It was permission to continue proving change. Blake remained after the others left. "I did not know the library situation was an evaluation," he said. "Would it have changed your response if you had known?" Naomi asked. He thought carefully. "A few months ago, yes. Today, no." Naomi placed the stained folder on the table between them. Then today mattered. Blake looked at the dark coffee mark across the federal seal. "Are you ever going to throw that away?" "No, to remember what I did. To remember what everyone allowed." His eyes moved toward the empty chairs where Tyler had laughed, Keller had minimized, and dozens had watched. "I used to think the worst part was that I humiliated you," he said. Now I think the worst part was how normal it felt. Naomi nodded. That is why change has to become normal too. Outside, evening settled across the training center. Officers moved through the halls carrying reports, equipment, and cups of coffee. A new civilian employee entered through the front doors wearing a temporary visitor badge. No one ordered her toward the break room. The receptionist greeted her by name, checked her appointment, and offered directions without deciding what role she belonged in. Naomi watched from the classroom doorway. The moment was ordinary, almost invisible. Months earlier, invisibility had protected the harm. Now ordinary respect was beginning to replace it. 1 year after Naomi first entered the training center with a temporary visitor badge, the Regional Crisis Response Partnership held its certification ceremony in Classroom 3. The room looked almost unchanged. The same rows of chairs faced the same projection screen. The same break room waited beyond the hallway. Yet the culture inside the building had shifted in ways no photograph could fully capture. Complaints were no longer closed by the nearest supervisor. Civilian employees attended operational briefings. New officers were trained to separate urgency from disrespect, uncertainty from guilt, and authority from truth. The department had completed 12 months of federal oversight with every required reform still active. Evelyn Ross stood at the lectern and announced full certification. The room applauded, but Naomi remained near the back beside Marcus Hill. She was not there to receive credit. She had learned that institutions often celebrated the person who exposed a problem more easily than the people who quietly prevented it from returning. Blake stood with the other officers, no longer wearing the instructor insignia he once treated like proof of superiority. He had earned a different role as a peer facilitator in the remediation program, but only after the review board required him to complete community sessions, supervised field evaluations, and written reflections on every complaint connected to his conduct. When Evelyn invited him forward, he carried no prepared speech. He placed a clear evidence sleeve on the lectern. Inside was the coffee-stained folder. Naomi looked at it, surprised. Dr. Carter allowed us to keep a certified copy for training, Blake said. I used to see this as the moment my career was threatened. Now I see it as the moment other people stopped paying for my certainty. Tyler sat in the front row, listening without the nervous smile he once used to protect himself. Keller sat beside the former probationary officer whose complaint she had dismissed. She was no longer a lieutenant. After completing her accountability program, she had accepted a civilian compliance position where her work was reviewed independently. The former officer had not forgiven her, and no one required him to. He had agreed only to help design the new reporting system because he wanted the next young employee to keep speaking. Blake turned toward Naomi. I cannot undo what I did to you or the others. I can only refuse to repeat it and refuse to ignore it when someone else does. Naomi walked to the front and stood beside him. The old stain had darkened with time, spreading across the page like a map of everything that had once been minimized. This folder is not proof that one person changed, she said. It is proof that harm becomes culture when enough people call it small. She looked around the room. Respect should not arrive after a title, a badge, or a federal credential appears. It should be present before anyone knows what power another person carries. No one applauded that sentence. The silence was more honest. After the ceremony, officers returned to work. A new class entered the building for orientation. Among them was a young black woman carrying a locked training case and wearing a temporary visitor badge because the printer had failed again. The receptionist greeted her by name. An officer held the elevator. Another asked whether she needed directions, not whether she belonged there. In the break room, Blake poured 2 cups of coffee and carried one to a civilian analyst reviewing case files. He introduced himself before asking a question. The analyst answered without hesitation. Naomi watched from the doorway, then turned toward the framed folder now mounted on the wall beside the incident log. Beneath it, a small metal plate carried a single sentence, "The lesson begins before the training does." She closed her equipment case and walked down the hallway as afternoon light stretched across the floor. The coffee stain remained, but the humiliation no longer defined the ending. What mattered was that people had learned to see bias while it was still small enough to stop. The next time a joke hides disrespect, a supervisor chooses comfort, or a stranger is judged before speaking, who should have the courage to interrupt the pattern first?